Sometime around the year 120 AD, 5,500 Roman soldiers stationed in northern Britain simply stop appearing in the historical record, and nobody, not then and not now, has ever been able to say with certainty what happened to them. And that is genuinely strange, because Rome was, if nothing else, an empire obsessed with paperwork, with inscriptions, with carving the names of units and commanders into stone for eternity, and yet one of its most famous legions, veterans of Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, veterans of the conquest of Britain itself, walks into the fog of the northern frontier and is never mentioned again in any surviving Roman document, which is exactly the kind of silence that should make you nervous, because in an empire that recorded everything, silence usually means something went badly enough that nobody wanted to write it down. The unit was called Legio IX Hispana, the 9th Spanish Legion, and its history did not begin with mystery. It began with more than a century and a half of hard, well-documented service that makes its eventual disappearance even more jarring by comparison. Some historians trace its origins as far back as around 90 BC, during the social war that reshaped the Roman Republic's relationship with its Italian allies, a brutal internal conflict that forced Rome to extend citizenship to its Italian allies after years of war rather than continued exclusion, which would make the 9th one of the oldest units in the entire Roman military system by the time it vanishes. A legion whose institutional roots stretch back to a Rome that hadn't even become an empire yet, a Rome still ruled by the Senate and consuls rather than emperors. What's better documented is that the 9th served under Pompey the Great before later fighting for Julius Caesar in Gaul, one of the legions that helped him crush the Gallic tribes and expand Roman territory all the way to the English Channel, which means these men, or at least the institutional lineage of these men, were present at some of the most consequential campaigns in the history of the Republic, campaigns that directly set the stage for Rome's transformation into an empire, campaigns that gave Caesar the veteran army and the personal loyalty of his soldiers that he would later need to cross the Rubicon and seize power for himself. After the civil wars that ended the Republic and brought Augustus to power, a period during which legions across the Roman world were reorganized, renumbered, and in some cases merged or disbanded entirely as the new emperor consolidated a military that had spent a generation fighting itself rather than Rome's actual enemies, the 9th continued in imperial service. One of the units trusted enough to survive that political purge with its identity and numbering intact. When Emperor Claudius launched the invasion of Britain in 43 AD, nearly a century after Julius Caesar had first landed there and left without conquering it, having decided the island wasn't worth the trouble at the time, the 9th was one of the 4 legions chosen for that invasion force, which tells you this was not some second-rate unit padded out with conscripts. This was one of the trusted instruments Rome used when it wanted a job done permanently. A legion Claudius was willing to stake a large part of his own political legitimacy on, since he badly needed a military triumph to secure his shaky hold on the throne after coming to power in circumstances that were, to put it mildly, unusual for an emperor. The legion took part in the brutal, decades-long process of subduing Britain, a conquest that never really finished the way Rome finished conquering, say, Gaul, because Britain kept fighting back in ways that Roman commanders found genuinely alarming, tribe after tribe rising up just as the last one had apparently been pacified. A pattern that would define Roman Britain for its entire existence as a province, and that would ultimately help explain why the empire's grip on its northern frontier there always remained looser and more contested than almost anywhere else it controlled. In the year 60 or 61 AD, the 9th was nearly wiped out in one of the most infamous uprisings in the history of the province, the revolt led by Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, whose warriors had just burned Camulodunum, modern Colchester, to the ground and were marching with a fury that came from very real Roman abuses against her people. Abuses that reportedly included the public flogging of the queen herself and assaults on her daughters after her late husband's kingdom was simply annexed, rather than respected as the will he had left behind intended. The commander of the 9th at the time, Quintus Petilius Cerealis, rushed his infantry forward to relieve the besieged town without waiting for proper reinforcement, a decision that in hindsight looks almost recklessly overconfident. The assumption of a Roman officer who could not conceive that a British Queen's warband could seriously threaten disciplined legionary infantry, and Boudica's forces annihilated his infantry column almost completely, leaving Cerealis to escape with little more than his cavalry while thousands of his own men lay dead on a British road, a defeat so severe that when the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus finally crushed Boudica's rebellion in a decisive pitched battle sometime later, he reportedly did so with only a fraction of the total forces Rome actually had in the province, because so much of the 9th had simply been destroyed in that earlier disaster. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the 9th Legion had already, once before, been effectively destroyed as a fighting force in Britain, and it still survived as an institution, rebuilt with fresh drafts of soldiers from other provinces, restored to full strength, and kept in continuous service for another 6 decades. Whatever eventually happened to it in the 2nd century, this was not a fragile unit that had never been tested. This was a legion that had already been broken once and had come back, which makes its eventual, quieter disappearance somehow even stranger, because Rome clearly had both the institutional will and the administrative capacity to rebuild this legion after genuine catastrophe. Something about whatever happened the second time was different enough that this time, there was no rebuilding, no fresh drafts of replacement soldiers, no continuation of the name. Through the following decades, the Ninth was stationed at various fortresses across Britain as Rome pushed the frontier further and further north, chasing a complete conquest of the island that it would, in the end, never quite achieve. An ambition that repeatedly ran into the simple economic and military reality that holding the highlands of what is now Scotland cost far more in soldiers and supply lines than the territory was actually worth to an empire whose attention was constantly being pulled toward richer, more strategically vital frontiers on the Rhine, the Danube, and in the east against Parthia. In the early 80s AD, the legion took part in the campaigns of Julius Agricola, the Roman governor whose biography, written by his own son-in-law, the historian Tacitus, gives us one of the most detailed accounts we have of any Roman military campaign in Britain, a biography that was, it should be said, also a piece of political flattery meant to burnish Agricola's reputation, which means we have to read its details with at least some awareness that Tacitus had every reason to make his father-in-law look good and everyone else, including perhaps the Ninth Legion itself, look slightly less competent by comparison. And it's from Tacitus that we get one of the most dramatic near-disasters in the Ninth's entire history, an episode that in hindsight almost reads like foreshadowing for whatever eventually happened decades later. While advancing into what is now Scotland, the Ninth Legion had been posted separately from the rest of Agricola's army in a fortified marching camp, split off according to the ordinary logistics of campaigning across difficult terrain where a single army couldn't always move or supply itself as one body, and Caledonian tribal warriors, recognizing that the Ninth was isolated and, according to Tacitus, weakened and under strength at that specific moment, launched a coordinated night assault directly into the camp. The sentries were overwhelmed in the darkness, and Caledonian warriors were soon fighting Roman soldiers inside their own fortifications in brutal, chaotic hand-to-hand combat, the kind of fight that Roman military doctrine was specifically designed to avoid, because Rome's real advantage was disciplined formation fighting in open ground, organized ranks and coordinated maneuver, not desperate scrambling in the dark where individual skill and numbers mattered more than training and formation. The Ninth came within what Tacitus describes as a hair's breadth of total destruction that night, and the only reason it survived at all was that Agricola, informed of the attack, force-marched reinforcements and cavalry through the night and struck the Caledonians from behind just as dawn broke, catching them between the recovering legionaries and his relief force and routing them completely. It was a rescue, not a victory earned by the Ninth itself, and Tacitus doesn't hide that uncomfortable fact, perhaps precisely because highlighting how close disaster came only makes Agricola's timely intervention look more impressive by contrast, a narrative structure that should make us at least slightly cautious about taking every detail of the Ninth's supposed weakness at face value. A year or so later, in 83 or 84 AD, the Ninth took part in the Battle of Mons Graupius, the climactic set-piece battle of Agricola's entire Caledonian campaign, where a combined Roman force including the Ninth, the 20th Legion, and Batavian auxiliary troops decisively broke the massed tribal army of a Caledonian leader named Calgacus, a chieftain who, in Tacitus's account, is given one of the most famous speeches in all of Roman historical writing, a searing condemnation of Roman imperialism placed, ironically, in the mouth of the very enemy Rome was about to defeat, in which Calgacus reportedly declared that the Romans make a desert and call it peace, a line so pointed that historians still debate whether Tacitus was really recording something Calgacus actually said or using his enemy as a mouthpiece to criticize Rome's own conduct from a safe distance. It was, on paper, one of the most complete Roman victories in the history of the British campaigns, and yet within just a few years of this triumph, Rome quietly abandoned most of the territory it had just conquered in Caledonia, pulling back to more defensible positions further south, an early sign that holding the far north of Britain was simply costing more than Rome was willing to keep paying, regardless of how decisive its battlefield victories there had been, a pattern of winning the fight and then abandoning the territory anyway that would, in a different and much darker way, echo through whatever eventually happened to the Ninth itself. The last unambiguous, dated evidence we have for the Ninth Legion in Britain comes from the year 108 AD, an inscription connected to the Legion rebuilding its fortress in stone at Eboracum, the Roman name for what is now the city of York, which had been the Ninth's home base for years, a substantial engineering project, replacing timber fortifications with permanent stone construction. The kind of investment an army makes when it expects to be staying in a place for a very long time, not the kind of work you'd commission if you already suspected the unit doing the building was about to be dissolved or destroyed. After that inscription, in Britain specifically, there is nothing. No battle report describing its destruction. No funerary inscription mourning fallen officers. No triumphant record of a victory. No administrative document reassigning it elsewhere. It is simply gone from the British archaeological and historical record, as if someone had erased an entire page from a book while leaving every page around it perfectly intact. For a very long time, the assumption among historians was straightforward and grim, that the Ninth Legion had been wiped out somewhere in the unconquered wilds of northern Britain, most likely fighting Brigantian rebels within the province or Caledonian tribes beyond its northern frontier, sometime in the years after 108. This was, in fact, the dominant theory for well over a century, championed by the influential German historian Theodor Mommsen, a man who won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his monumental history of Rome, an extraordinary achievement for a work of historical scholarship, and whose interpretation shaped how generations of scholars and, eventually, novelists understood this mystery. Mommsen argued that the total silence surrounding the Ninth after this point was itself the evidence that an institution as bureaucratically thorough as Rome would only stop mentioning an entire legion if that legion had ceased to exist in some catastrophic and probably embarrassing way, the kind of defeat an emperor might prefer to quietly bury rather than commemorate, pointing to the later construction of Hadrian's Wall, begun around 122 AD under the Emperor Hadrian, as possible indirect evidence, a massive and expensive fortification project that some historians have connected to exactly the kind of northern military catastrophe that might have convinced Rome to stop trying to conquer the Scottish Highlands altogether and instead simply wall the whole problem off. This version of the story is the one that eventually inspired novels and films about a lost legion swallowed by the mists of Caledonia, its eagle standard, the sacred symbol whose loss was considered one of the deepest disgraces a Roman legion could suffer, captured by tribes Rome never managed to subdue, an image so evocative that it has outlived the historical debate that produced it, appearing in adventure novels for children and adults alike throughout the 20th century as a kind of foundational myth of the mysterious, savage North swallowing up civilization's most disciplined soldiers. But here's where the story gets genuinely more interesting, because the archaeological picture has shifted since Mommsen's time, and not in a way that makes the mystery any simpler. Tile stamps and inscribed artifacts bearing the Ninth Legion's name have been discovered far from Britain entirely, at a Roman fortress called Noviomagos Batavorum, in what is now Nijmegen in the Netherlands, dated to somewhere between roughly 104 and 120 AD. A silver medal, a phalera, inscribed with letters identifying the Ninth Hispana has turned up in that same region, along with an altar dedicated to Apollo, erected by an officer identified as the chief centurion and camp prefect of the Ninth, a senior officer's personal religious dedication, exactly the kind of artifact a real, functioning unit produces as part of ordinary military and religious life, not the kind of thing you'd expect from a legion that had already been annihilated years earlier in a different country entirely. This evidence has pushed a significant number of modern historians to argue that at least part of the Ninth, whether the whole legion or a detachment of it, was very much alive after 108, very much intact, and had been transferred out of Britain entirely to serve on the European continent, which would mean the popular image of a legion swallowed whole by Scottish mist is, at best, incomplete, and at worst, simply wrong, a romantic story built on an absence of evidence that later evidence has since complicated rather than confirmed. If the Ninth really was still functioning as a unit around 120 AD, stationed on the Rhine frontier in the Netherlands, then the mystery doesn't disappear, it just relocates and changes shape, because the legion still stops appearing in the historical record after that point regardless of where it was based, and now historians have to explain not a British catastrophe but a continental one, or possibly one further away still. One theory that has gained real traction connects the legion's final disappearance to a war that erupts a little over a decade later, far to the east, in the Roman province of Judea. In 132 AD, a Jewish uprising against Roman rule broke out under a leader named Simon Bar Kokhba, a revolt so ferocious and so costly that it is remembered as one of the most brutal wars Rome ever fought to hold a province, a conflict that reportedly consumed entire legions' worth of Roman manpower before it was finally crushed, and that ended, when it was finally over, with such devastating consequences for the Jewish population of Judea, including mass killings, enslavement, and the renaming of the province itself, that the war is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the history of Roman rule in the region, a scale of brutal, grinding conflict on both sides that gives some sense of just how costly it would have been for any legion unfortunate enough to be thrown into the worst of that fighting. Some historians have proposed that the Ninth, transferred from the Rhine frontier to reinforce Roman forces struggling against Bar Kokhba's rebels, was thrown into that meat grinder of a war and effectively ceased to exist there, its survivors folded into other units, its name simply allowed to lapse rather than officially recorded as destroyed. Because admitting an entire legion had been annihilated by rebels in a minor province was not the kind of thing an emperor wanted etched into stone for. The ages, especially not an emperor like Hadrian, who spent much of his reign carefully cultivating an image of stability and consolidation rather than crisis, touring the provinces, building monuments, and generally presenting the empire as secure and well-managed rather than one that had just lost an entire legion to a provincial uprising. Strengthening this theory just slightly is an odd historical coincidence. Another Roman legion, the 22nd Dioteriana, based in Egypt, also vanishes from the historical record at almost exactly the same time, in the same general period, with some evidence suggesting it too may have been drawn into the fighting in Judea and destroyed there, possibly even by Parthian forces rather than Jewish rebels, depending on which fragmentary account you trust, since the eastern frontier was rarely quiet for long and multiple threats sometimes converged in the same turbulent years. If both of these disappearances are connected to the same war, it would mean Rome quietly absorbed one of its most humiliating military disasters since the legendary slaughter of 3 entire legions in the Teutoburg forest more than a century earlier, a catastrophe so significant to Roman military memory that the Emperor Augustus was said to have banged his head against a door crying out for his legions back, refusing for months afterward to even cut his hair or beard in mourning, a story that shows just how deeply the loss of a legion could wound Roman self-image even generations later. And yet, if 2 legions really were destroyed fighting Jewish rebels in the 130s, almost nothing survives to tell us so directly. We only know it through absence, through the quiet cessation of a name that used to appear on tile stamps and inscriptions with total regularity, and then simply doesn't anymore, a historical silence that, unlike the aftermath of Teutoburg, produced no famous outburst of imperial grief, no monuments of remembrance. Nothing but a name that stopped showing up in the record as though a bureaucrat had simply crossed it off a list one afternoon and moved on to other business. There is, it should be said, also a third and considerably less dramatic possibility that a number of more skeptical modern scholars have pushed back with, arguing that we may simply be overinterpreting an administrative silence as a military catastrophe. Roman legions were occasionally disbanded or merged for entirely mundane reasons that had nothing to do with battlefield destruction. Sometimes because an emperor decided the empire had more legions than it needed or could afford to pay, sometimes because chronic understrength numbers made a unit not worth maintaining as a separate legion any longer, and its soldiers were simply folded into other legions that absorbed both the men and, eventually, the memory of the unit they'd come from. Under this reading, the Ninth might not have died dramatically at all, in Britain or Judea or anywhere else. It might simply have been quietly wound down as an administrative decision, its remaining veterans reassigned, its name allowed to lapse the way a company might discontinue a brand without anyone writing a eulogy for it, and if that's what actually happened, it would mean one of history's most famous military mysteries has, underneath all the legend, nothing more dramatic at its core than Roman bureaucratic housekeeping, a distinctly unsatisfying answer compared to lost battles and vanished eagles, but one that fits at least as comfortably with the limited evidence as either of the more violent theories. So where does that actually leave us, after all this evidence and all these competing theories? It leaves us in a genuinely unusual position for Roman military history, because normally when a legion is destroyed, Rome tells you about it, sometimes in painful detail, precisely because it wants to explain why revenge is coming or why a general has been recalled in disgrace. The way the disaster at Teutoburg Forest is discussed at length by multiple surviving Roman authors specifically because Rome needed to process and eventually avenge that loss in the public imagination. The fate of the Ninth is different specifically because it isn't dramatically documented at all, it's simply an absence, a gap where a name used to be, and historians have had to build an entire structure of competing hypotheses on top of that silence, none of them provable, none of them disprovable with the evidence currently available. It could have died fighting rebels in the unconquered north of Britain sometime after 108, the old and once dominant theory, a version of events that still has serious modern defenders, including historians who argue that the sheer scale of construction that went into Hadrian's Wall only a decade or so later makes far more sense if it followed directly on the heels of a genuine military catastrophe in the region, rather than simply being a peacetime border management project. It could have been transferred to the Rhine, survived for over a decade in the Netherlands, and then been destroyed fighting a brutal insurgency in Judea in the 130s, A theory that fits the archaeological tile stamps but requires its own leap of faith about what happened next, since we have no direct evidence placing the ninth specifically inside the Judean war zone. Only the coincidence of timing and the disappearance of another Egyptian-based legion in roughly the same period. Or it could, in the least dramatic version, have simply been disbanded administratively, its soldiers absorbed into other units during one of Rome's periodic reorganizations, its name allowed to lapse not because of catastrophe but because of ordinary bureaucratic housekeeping that simply wasn't important enough for anyone to write down for us to find 2,000 years later. What's genuinely remarkable, when you step back from the theories, is how much this mystery reveals about the limits of what even the most heavily documented ancient civilization actually preserved for us. Rome carved its victories into triumphal arches and its defeats, when it chose to record them at all, into the margins of histories written by men with their own political interests and their own gaps in information, men writing decades or even centuries after the events they described, working from fragments, rumors, and earlier historians whose own original texts have since been lost entirely, so that even the surviving Roman accounts we do have are themselves several steps removed from anyone who could have told us firsthand what actually happened. An entire legion, thousands of trained soldiers, wives and camp followers living just outside the fortress walls in the sprawling civilian settlements that always grew up around a permanent Roman military base, decades of institutional memory and unit pride built up over nearly 2 centuries of continuous service, could apparently pass out of the historical record almost as quietly as if it had never existed at all, and the only reason we know something happened is that the silence itself is loud enough to be strange. As one historian who has written an entire book trying to answer this question ultimately concluded, unless some extraordinary new piece of evidence surfaces, a lost inscription, an undiscovered battlefield, a document nobody has read in 18 centuries sitting forgotten in some archive or buried in some field waiting for the right archaeologist's shovel, we will probably never know for certain what happened to the Ninth Legion, and there is something almost unbearably human about that. An entire community of people, real people with names and families and decades of shared service, men who had marched with Caesar's institutional legacy, survived Boudica's fury, weathered a near disaster in the dark hills of Caledonia, and helped win one of Rome's most complete victories on British soil, reduced in the end to a question mark that has outlasted the empire that lost them. A silence so complete that 2,000 years later, we are still arguing about which kind of ending they actually got.